Hi, I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream. Today, editing the human genome. What can genetic editing technology accomplish, and should there be limits to the science? Let us know what your take is on gene editing. Just chat your comments and questions to us live via YouTube or Twitter. Chinese scientist He Jiankui has claimed to have created the world's first gene-edited human babies, twin girls who are resistant to HIV. Last week, the news was leaked online ahead of He's presentation at a global gene editing conference in Hong Kong. Although the results of He's experiment have yet to be independently verified, they have nonetheless sparked condemnation and conversation about scientific research ethics and how a powerful genetic editing tool known as CRISPR should be used. So why was this experiment so controversial, and what else could gene editing achieve? Joining us to discuss this from Boston, journalist and bioethicist Alex Perlman. In Berkeley, California, Fyodor Ornov, a gene editor and deputy director of the California-based Innovative Genomics Institute. Also in Boston is Glenn Cohen, faculty director of Harvard University's Petrie Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. Welcome to the stream, everyone. It's so good to have you here. Let's start on my laptop with the publication that broke the story. This from MIT Technology Review. Exclusive: Chinese scientists are creating CRISPR babies. Fyodor, what was your first reaction to hearing that a young researcher had allegedly made the first CRISPR-edited baby?
Sadness. Gene editing is a powerful technology that is doing and can do much good for the world, including for people with HIV and people with genetic disease. This is not the way in which gene editing should face the public, where we talk about rogue scientists making designer babies outside of existing ethical frameworks. So when Antonio sent me the data, I wrote him back and said, Antonio, this is a sad day.
And Antonio, being the reporter behind that MIT article there, you're not the only one. This from Scientific Nick on Twitter, who says, I'm struggling to describe how I'm feeling watching this presentation and Q&A. There is so much wrong with the research, the medical benefit, the secrecy, the lack of informed consent. This is not what science is about. This is a display of ego. So that's one person's perspective. But I want to take you into the room where this happened. I want you to have a listen to some of the reactions from scientists who were at that summit in Hong Kong on November 28th.
I don't think this should have been done. I think it's unfortunate. It would have been good if we'd known more about it before this meeting came up. So
it's an appalling example of what not to do with a new technology that has incredible potential to benefit society.
I'm grateful that he appeared today in the meeting as scheduled to present his work. I think that was appropriate. But I don't think we heard answers to the questions that were asked. So I think we still need to understand the motivation for the study and what the process was for informed consent and how the children will now be monitored. And I don't know the answers because we didn't hear them today.
Now, that last comment was from UC Berkeley professor Jennifer Doudna, one of the co-inventors of CRISPR. Glenn, you heard their comments there. When was the last time you can remember that there was so much controversy after a science conference? And can you understand their reactions?
Totally understand their reactions. I mean, this is unprecedented, and I agree completely with Professor Doudna and other people that this was completely unethical the way this is done. The problem, though, is I think people will have the reaction to this particular experiment with its deficits of informed consent, deficits in oversight, the question of what was targeted, and that will be extrapolated to a critique of CRISPR more generally. And that, I think, is problematic and unfortunate because, as one of your other guests suggested, there's a lot of good that can be done through these technologies, both in somatic cell editing, that's editing adult cells, and also germline editing when we are editing cells that will be heritable and passed on. So it's really unfortunate that CRISPR is going to be given a really black mark because of this particular event.
We got this tweet in just now, Alex. Nirakar says, this is an act of an amateur. I see this as an irresponsible and unethical act to achieve fame using a shortcut without considering the grave consequences it could bring. And I guess you've already read, heard, and learned much about the reaction of the scientific community until now. So he's on our same wavelength. Thank you for that, Nirakar. Alex, your take.
I mean, I totally agree with everything that's been said, and especially the person on Twitter making the point about it being a play for fame. I think that the timing of the release just ahead of the gene editing summit, not to mention the fact that he had contracted with a PR agency and released a number of YouTube videos before he released any data into a peer-reviewed journal. I mean, I think that all lined up, that evidence suggests that a quest for fame and ego was a big motivator here, which is really unfortunate because with science that is so crucial and has so much potential, and which is so widely misunderstood in much of the general public, this was a really terrible decision on his part and on the behalf of anyone who collaborated with him.
So before we get too much further, I want to make sure our audience is all on the same page. And to do that, I'm bringing up this tweet from Amanda. Amanda says, in trying to explain what it is we're talking about when we say CRISPR, Amanda says, I think using the science metaphor is the best. And the idea that the CRISPR system works like a scissor, where we're able to go into a cell and cut the DNA of the genome at a targeted place. Then we can either remove a piece of DNA or provide a template to add and modify the DNA. As I was reading that, I'll let our audience know. I could see Glenn kind of light up there. Does this topic excite you? Help us understand CRISPR.
So there's, we have a science colleague who does it, so I'll defer to him in a moment, but I'll say there's a bunch of different metaphors that are used. The science people cringe at each of them because none of them are perfect. The other examples are find and replace on Microsoft Word or your word processor. And then another example that I think is actually most interesting is a most wanted poster, the idea that you will have a most wanted poster for certain kinds of viruses or bits of DNA that you're replacing. But what's important to understand is not everybody's a good scissorer. I'm not very good at cutting. So if I cut, I will make mistakes, and that is true with CRISPR as well. There may be off-target alterations, but I'll defer to my science colleague, who I think will give a more accurate statement about this.
Fyodor?
The person on Twitter named Amanda should write science textbooks. It's a good metaphor. I think the broader point that people should appreciate is this. The human DNA, the human genome, is not unchangeable. It's not like some piece of classical music by Bach where every note is precisely in place. Since humans emerged in Africa 200,000 years ago, our DNA has been in flux. It changes because we inhabit different environments. It changes because for all sorts of reasons. So, for example, this naturally occurring form of the CCR5 gene, which is discussed, which is what Jiankui allegedly edited in the embryos that then became the two girls. That gene naturally mutated in humans millennia ago to give us now existing human beings who don't have a normal copy of that gene and are thus resistant to HIV. So here I think is the single probably biggest lesson for all of us. We live in an age where there is such a thing called Microsoft Word for human DNA. That cat is out of the bag and genie is out of the bottle. Question is, what do we do with Microsoft Word? What do we write in human DNA? And as my colleagues on the call just mentioned, there is a large number of ongoing efforts, they're called clinical trials, to treat serious disease such as cancer, diseases of the liver, blindness. Just recently, a company in Cambridge called Editas Medicine announced that they're starting a clinical trial using CRISPR in individuals with genetic diseases of vision. So that's what you can do with Microsoft Word for your DNA. You can change it to treat your existing disease. Or I guess if you're Jiankui He and are motivated by we don't know what, although I second my colleague's comments that it is probably something to do with ego, you can take embryos and for no medical reason unethically get rid of one gene in the hopes of gaining, again, we don't quite know what. So from my perspective as a gene editor, I'm really hopeful that your audience and people the world over understand that gene editing is not in the hands of rogue scientists doing harm. It is largely in the hands of sane, ethical, responsible scientists and clinicians who wish to use it to really change the way we treat human disease.
Well, Theodore, here's one person who'll make you happy. I think he understands that. This is Nafizi, who says gene editing is the future of preventative medicine. Genetic diseases such as hemophilia, sickle cell anemia, etc., will all be prevented before birth. So there's one idea of what this could do. But that is speaking of a medical need. People who have serious hereditary diseases who need this. What I've seen a lot online is that this trial or this experiment did not meet that category. Kendra here says there is no unmet medical need whatsoever, given that there were alternatives and better means to prevent HIV infection. And this is speaking, of course, of the case at the center of this with He Jiankui. Another person wrote in and sent us a video comment on that same idea, the unmet medical need. I want you to have a listen to Krishanu, who is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin. Here's what he told the stream.
At our lab meeting this week, we had a really animated discussion of what unmet medical need really meant and how it could be addressed by genome editing. And it was really important for my students to understand that there are boundaries to what we can do in the lab. Since the field has been moving so much over the last 4 to 5 years, it was really an important case study to discuss.
Alex, your take?
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
Well, Alex, you go first, and Glenn, you follow up after.
Unfortunately, I cut out a little bit at the beginning, so but I'll just go back to your original question about an unmet medical need. And yeah, the question about this experiment in China specifically does not meet that criteria. There are so many ways that are established and proven to prevent transmission of the HIV virus, and this was not one of them. Not to mention, the babies weren't going to be infected with the virus if they were using one of these other methods that were already proven. So they weren't curing them of anything that they already had. So that would be the definition of a medical need, something that was already going to be in their genetic code. And this didn't meet that. And I think Glenn can probably talk more about the other side of the coin, which is enhancement, and whether we should be looking at a different ethical code for what comes if there's no unmet medical need, if it counts as something that's different or more than.
So both Glenn and Theodore are nodding their heads. Glenn?
Yeah, so 2 quick points. The first is I think this Microsoft Word analogy is useful for another reason, which is the democratization of the word processor. You went back 50 years ago, the type of people who could do what Microsoft Word could do were a small number of people with very expensive computers. Now everybody can do Microsoft Word. CRISPR-Cas9 is not quite there, but it's so much more available than many other kinds of technologies we might use and easier to use. So that really does up the stakes in that if you think you are a government who's trying to stamp this out or prevent bad uses, it's much harder in a world where the technology is widely available. The second point, which is the one that Alex was alluding to, is I think we should make 2 pretty fundamental distinctions to begin with. One is between somatic versus germline alterations. Many of the therapeutics we're interested in are about somatic alterations. The changes we make will not be passed along to future generations, which is the case where we have the most ethical questions. And even within the germline, some people make a distinction between treatment versus enhancement. Treatment is about restoring health. Enhancement is about taking you beyond what would be typical for your species if it was functioning normally. Now, in the United States, the National Academies of Medicine have taken the position that CRISPR could be used for treatment if it's a serious medical condition. There's lots of safety studies. There is no other good solutions, but they've taken a firm position against the use of enhancement. By contrast, in the UK, they've taken the position that enhancement might be okay too. And a lot of this turns on whether you think the line between treatment and enhancement is a real line, or whether it's very fuzzy or not morally salient.
So very good question there, because that brings me to this point, and I hear you there, Alex. I'll go to you with this, but that idea between that thin line between enhancement. We got a couple of comments on YouTube, and there's several. There's a really good chat going on there. So if you are watching at home, head over to YouTube now. There's an alarmist nature to it. So Jae Sung says, blonde hair and blue eyes will now be a choice, and I can't wait. Another person writes in saying that gene editing will begin a phenotypic scientific revolution, which will be the downfall of humankind. It must be outlawed. So there are some misconceptions here, Alex.
Yeah, I think that those are sort of the ones that people jump to for a knee-jerk reaction when they hear something like enhanced babies. They're the very stereotypical immediate reactions to blue eyes and blonde hair, and that this will be the downfall of us all. And while, those thoughts are not, out of line by any means, I think it's very extreme and exaggerated, and that there are much more real world considerations that go to questions about who gets to access the technology. So even if it does exist and there is a way to enhance embryos using this technology or whatever comes after CRISPR, because CRISPR is not precise, nor will it be the last gene editing revolution that we see, it goes to the question about who gets to use it, how are they going to use it, how much is it going to cost, what kind of regulations will be in place to monitor or control its use, and where. And we're already seeing these kinds of questions come up, not just with gene therapies, but all kinds of medication and all kinds of health intervention, that there are issues of distributive justice. And when you start bringing the idea of enhancing humans into that conversation, it becomes a much more concerning one. And certainly issues of who gets to use CRISPR and how,
Right.
I think are much more real world and timely things that we need to figure out than whether it's going to be used for blue eyes across the board, which again, I think is an exaggeration.
So then who gets to use CRISPR and who does not? I want to direct your attention to this tweet from Pierre Theodore. Pierre says, if we have the tech, we will use it. So best to come up with solid guidelines right away. I'm okay with editing lethal defects, giving protection from disease and generally health-related problems. It is problematic to edit for beauty, skin color, etc. So on the note of if we have the tech, we will use it, I actually want to hear from the man at the center of this. I want to hear from Mr. He himself. Here he is speaking on camera about this procedure. Have a listen.
I know this is probably going to be the world first. So if it's not safe or have any problem, it may rule the entire field, and the people may lose trust in the new technology.
He says we could lose trust. And in that same interview that he gave back in October, he goes on to say there will be someone somewhere who is doing this. And if it's not me, it's someone else. Fyodor, does that excite you or does that worry you?
Allow me to offer the following message to your audience. If you get an email from a gene editor saying, please go to designyourbaby.com and we will use CRISPR to custom build your child, delete that email immediately. I mean, in broad strokes, CRISPR today is used in clinical trials to treat existing disease. And I suspect that some folks in your audience have it. You should have hope. People world over are working on CRISPR-based approaches to treat genetic disease that you have or members of your family have. And these clinical trials are ongoing. The next question, one of your Twitter users brought up the notion of getting rid of genetic defects before birth. Well, folks, frankly, there already is a technology to do that. It's called prenatal genetic diagnostics. It is safe. I won't comment to the ethics, but I know it is widely practiced. And my understanding, it is done with rigorous informed consent. My point is, if you have viewers who are considering having a child and are concerned about a risk of a genetic disease to that child because of a gene that they themselves have, they will be able to, approach this problem by using existing safe and effective treatments. Last point about enhancement. Look, let me give you an example. There is a variant of a gene that gives you a higher risk for Alzheimer's. Do I want to have it? No. Would I like to get rid of it? Yes. So imagine how we do the clinical trial. Day one, we take an embryo, we get rid of that variant of the gene. 9 months later, we have a baby. And then we wait 70 years to see if that worked. So you see where the problem lies. I mean, when we talk about embryo editing, we're talking about looking at effects for the life of the person. So that creates a huge challenge in terms of how you do this ethically and respectfully of the human autonomy, which is why I reiterate, CRISPR is right now useful to treat existing disease in adults and children. And that, from my perspective, is exactly the way it should stay.
News you can use for our audience. Thank you for that. Glenn, Thomas here on Twitter writes in that moving forward, I think universities or even grant committees could really monitor these situations to prevent them from happening, especially people who work with IVF, in vitro fertilization, and preventing them from happening. I am assuming there he means ones that go outside the lines of regulation. What do you think should be done when it comes to regulation? Who should be overseeing this?
Absolutely. So universities have a crucial role to play, down to funders. But here in the United States, I think this is not well understood. It is actually against the law to change an embryo to create a germline edit that will be passed on for future generations. Congress basically passed a statute saying that FDA cannot give an exception for this. And as a result, if you try to do this in a clinical context and try to produce an embryo, you're violating the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and you'll be subject to sanction. So if you're worried about it, here in the United States, this is illegal. Now, I also understand that the Chinese authorities are claiming that it was also illegal in China. So you might be worried that the law, just because it's on the books and just because it's enforced, won't deter exceptional people who have it in their head that they want to be the first to do something. But that's important for people to understand. If you're worried about this in the U.S., it is currently against the law.
So should the UN step in? Here's what the Director General of the WHO had to say in the UN, just being one of the bodies that people are saying they should be the ones who have a say. So I want you to have a listen to Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus on December 3rd.
You know, this issue of gene editing is serious because it has ethical, social, and safety issues in it. And it cannot be just done without clear guidelines. Gene editing may have unintended consequences, so this is uncharted water, and it has to be taken seriously.
So, Alex, the WHO has said it is putting together a team to be in charge of this. What's your take on that, and who do you think should be policing it?
Sure. Well, I think policing is an interesting word because, of course, there is no international CRISPR police, nor is there an international agreement that a lot of countries have bought into, and that's
Should
sort of
there
what
be?
Well, I think that there should be, and a number of other people do too, and that was the point of the Gene Edit Summit, both the first one sort of to discuss whether there should be, and the second one to discuss what it might look like going forward. But there hasn't been one yet, and I think that it's ambitious and optimistic for the UN to think that they could step in here. I think that countries need to do a better job on a local level, domestically, looking at what their universities, again, are doing, what people who are funding science are looking into, and then also make sure that if there are countries who have sort of lapsed or out-of-date regulations that focus on germline editing or anything related to that, that they need to take a closer look on how their countries might be used as havens for scientists who want to leave countries where there are more stringent laws. So this really, needs to be something that is dealt with domestically by countries across the board. And again, it's not a good idea to wait.
I just want to emphasize.
Theodore?
Sorry, Amanda. I just want to strengthen your point by saying that I think, Al Jazeera and other media outlets, I think, are doing a great job carrying this message to the people, frankly. People need to know that embryo editing is unethical, unsafe, and unnecessary. So that when they get an email reach out saying, would you like to design a baby, they say, actually, no. So I completely agree with Amanda. There is no world CRISPR police. So educating the public the way you are currently doing, and I'm grateful for that, is, I think, one key avenue of engagement.
I agree, and I think that, again, when we're talking about regulating locally and domestically, obviously, in a lot of places, that has to do with the people, and that's about electing representatives who are knowledgeable about science and who care about issues of access for healthcare and who want to place common sense regulations
Alex,
on it.
raising all types of interesting questions that are great for future shows. That's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much to Alex Perlman, Fyodor Arnav, and Glenn Cohen for being part of this conversation. Of course, thank you to our community for joining in as well. I'll end with this tweet from Hosea, who says, from watching that presentation, it seems that the work was pretty legit. There's a pretty good chance that the world's first genetically modified human beings were born. I couldn't sleep. So astounding. So one perspective there. We'll see you online.